I chose this topic not because I'm an expert in it. I'm not an expert in networks. Okay? I'll say that right up front. This is my disclaimer. I'm not an expert in this topic. But I do recognize from talking to researchers across a lot of different fields and a lot of industries that this is really important, very hot topic. So I'm discussing it not because I'm an expert, but because I think it's important to sort of raise awareness that this is an area of a lot of interest, particularly for students who might be listening or might watch this and say, hey, I'm really interested in working in statistics and doing something that is kind of fun and relevant, and gee, I wonder what I could do. So that's why I decided to talk about it. So if you have questions, I will definitely try to answer them, or I will not try to answer them, or I will defer them. But I will do my best on this. Okay, so stat networks. Why is this important? Well, obviously it's gained a lot of interest, and I think it kind of came into public interest just because of the social media aspect of it. A lot of people are interested in who's talking to whom, and the potential for analyzing huge, vast amounts of data on like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and blah, blah. And so the social scientists have gotten incredibly interested in the whole data science area and big data, which traditionally was not particularly their forte. But our social analysis group at Nebraska is sort of sociologists and computer scientists and statisticians looking at interesting questions in social media, and they solve really cool problems. Like they use social media to do things like find a parking space in New York City, just by following people's tweets and following the information that comes out of parking meters, right? So this is a picture from a tool that's called NodeXL. It's actually designed to it's from the Social Media Research Foundation. It's actually designed to analyze Twitter data as an Excel plugin, right? So it was designed by a bunch of computer scientists who felt that, network analysis should not be this black boxy thing that only experts do. And so they designed this plugin. This is in a response. This is a Twitter network from a response from the pink slime. So does anybody remember pink slime? Yeah, if you lived in Nebraska, you definitely heard a lot about pink slime. Not in a good way. So after that came out and sort of hit the news media, then, the Twitter universe went nuts. And this is looking at the Twitter space about pink slime and who are the big talkers, right? So you see, and what are their hashtags? What are their hash words? And you can see like clusters of people talking about the USDA and food politics, and then you can see another group that's talking about food safety and food safety in agriculture. There's a group talking about school lunches and the food and nutrition in school lunches. There's a group that's talking about the American meat industry and their response to pink slime, and there's a group that talks about healthy foods and the importance of a food revolution, and we should all be, eating farm-fed organic. And they're all talking to each other, and there's links between groups, and then there's links within groups. And so scientists use this kind of information to figure out how human behavior, how do people behave, and then how do people behave in Twitter space, right? So what are the roles of different individuals in Twitter space, and does online behavior differ significantly from like in-person behavior, right? So of course it does, right? So there are certain I do this all the time. I'm in an email exchange with someone, and they say something, and I go, oh, yeah, right. And I start crafting a response, literally crafting, that's my word for it. I don't just write email. I'm crafting a nice response. And after about 25 minutes, I go, what the hell am I doing? And I pick up the phone, and I go, hey, okay, let's just do this in like 20 minutes. Okay, you got coffee? Yes, we're good. Like, why am I, but I'm so attuned to responding by email or through electronic media that I start trying to craft this thing, and then I realize, wait, somebody could misread that, and and then I go, oh, it's a phone. Use the phone, right? It still works. It still calls people. You can use it. And of course, people on a Twitter space and social media are much more likely to be nasty, brutal, write things and say things that they would never say in public, right? Just because there's this sort of anonymity that goes with social space, right? And we all do this when we review papers. Have you ever got like the nasty report from the reviewer where you're like, that person would have never really said that to me, but because it's anonymous, they're going to say that to me. So there's a behavior shift when people go from in-person to online, right? And so sociologists are really interested in this phenomenon. And here's another one from biology, right? So this is looking at gene expression networks. And when biologists look at expression networks or protein-protein interaction networks, they're interested in what's the topology of the network? What are the roles that different proteins are playing? Is this like a hub protein, so it's driving lots of other things? Or is this just have a lot of in and outs? The protein has a lot of connections, well connected. And so they think about things like that in networks. Partly because when you get really large networks and you try to look at them, it just looks like a hairball. I had a paper once where we were doing proteins and gene expressions, and we had, like 300,000. It's like, yes, I can plot that, but it looks like a ball of yarn, and it's not informative. It's just a bunch of scribbles. It doesn't help me. So they start thinking about substructures in networks. Okay, so I'm going to focus on ways to do statistical analysis of networks instead of like the computer science conceptualization of networks. So we think of things different. So when I say networks, it's kind of a very vague term. When I say networks to people in engineering, they think communication networks, they think transportation networks. They don't really think of it as network modeling, like a network as a statistical model. So that's how I'm going to think about it, because I know most of you guys are statisticians. Okay, so there's some basic standard problems that are shared across network science from a statistical perspective, regardless of your context. So whether you're working in social space or technological space or biological space or chemical space, these are sort of standard questions. One is network mapping and characterization, right? What is the network? And if you have a bunch of data where there's all these relationships, how do you look at it? How do you represent that? So it's really the mapping of data to networks and the characterizing of it. There's network sampling. So if you're working in a very, very large space, like Twitter or Google or something, you can't visualize the entire network. It's just not feasible. And so what they do is they try to infer things about the network by sampling from it. And the question is, how do you sample from a space that has all these complex dependencies in it and get a sample that's actually representative of the entire network? That's a non-trivial problem. And then network inference. What can we infer about the network? Can we say something about where the network is going to be at time t+1 if we're at time t? We're talking about a dynamic system. So one of the fun parts of network processes is that it's a process, right? And so you can look at a network as a snapshot in time, and you can also think about networks as evolving over time, and you can look at how they evolve. So some of the challenges. It's all very relational data. Forget about IID. No, not IID. Very complicated, and you don't always have a complete picture of those relationships. You might just have like a snapshot of them. Complex dependencies, very high dimensional, and not static necessarily, right? Dynamic networks. So those are the challenges. Okay, so this is just a nice cartoon of the way that people think about network mapping and characterization, right? So they start by just collecting data. Collect a certain amount of data that you think is going to have information about how the objects in the data are relating to each other. You construct a graph or network, right? So graph G, it's got vertices in it, which, if you're talking about social networks would be like people. Nodes, right? Vertices. And then you have edges, which connect the nodes or vertices in your graph. Then you try to take a look at it, see if it makes sense. How do you visualize what that thing is saying? Then you might try to validate it, which is more and more common to do validation. So you might build your network and then say, well, okay, I looked at this certain part of social network space at noon on Tuesday, so I'm going to build my network, and then I'm going to look at it again noon on Wednesday and see if it's if it looks similar, right? Some sort of validation. If it's a biological network, you might actually go to the lab, right? So if you had a protein-protein interaction network, you might say, oh, I hypothesize that these two proteins actually work together, and that if I go to the lab, I'll be able to see them. I'll be able to see that interaction. So you might go into the lab and do it, and then you figure out whether you need to collect more data or not. And so there's this cycle of updating of networks. Okay. How do you map or characterize? First, you have to ask yourself, what do we want to map? What are we trying to investigate? Do we just want to look at the objects in the network? Who is important to represent in the network? Or do we want to really look at their relationships to each other? Right? Those can be two separate questions. It's like who should be there, and then or who's there or is interacting. Do you have full information or just partial information? So if you ask, if you go to Twitter and you ask them for a certain amount of Twitter data, they'll give you data, but they won't give you all of the data. So you can ask, for example, for, I want all the Twitter feeds at a certain amount of time that have this hashtag, but you can't ask them, I want all the Twitter feeds at this time that have this hashtag, and then I want all the other people that they talked to over the last hour. So, sorry. No, right? So they will give you a certain amount of data, but it's a limited piece, right? If you're going to do sampling from a very large network, how are you going to sample? And what do you want to sample? Some people are interested in sampling the nodes because they want to characterize the individuals in the network. Some of them are interested in sampling subnetworks. So you might have a big network where you see these little interconnected groups of people. They're all talking to each other. Maybe you want to sample those structures and see how often they appear. How are you going to deal with missing data? A lot of missing data, right? Especially in social network stuff, a lot of missing data. How are you going to handle the missing data? And what are you going to define as your similarity metric? So, for example, if you're going to build an edge between two people, how do you decide whether you want to put an edge there or not? Right? So it might be, their behaviors over the last week are very similar. What do you mean by similar? Is it correlation above a certain threshold? Do you want to use correlation, or do you want to use mutual information? How are you defining what you think of as a connection? Which is also non-trivial. I love the cartoon. Well, not really. Help me. Okay, so here's a good example of visualizing. If you're going to visualize a network that's very high dimensional, lots of people interacting in different ways, you have to project into a lower dimension, because as I said earlier, humans don't see in 10,000 dimensions. We see in 2 or 3 dimensions, maybe 4 if you allow it to be dynamic over time. You might capture time, but that's about it. And that projecting and bringing things down to a lower dimensional space is not a unique process. So these 2 graphs show the same data, right? The network and the hierarchy. Same information in those 2 pictures, but looks very different. At least to me, looks very different. So when I look at the thing on the left, I'm like, you got like 2 subgraphs and they're talking to each other, and then there's 2 people that are linking the 2 subnetworks, cool. And then I look at the hierarchical thing and I'm like, well, yeah, you have people on one side and the other, but it looks much more top down. It's just, I think differently about those 2 pictures, even though the data is the same, right? So not unique in terms of visualization, which is a good challenge. So how do you characterize networks? Well, it's looking at structure, basically. A network is a structural thing. So you're going to look at things like degree distributions. What does that mean? Well, degree, if you're a person in the network, your degree is the number of connections you have. So if you're a high degree node or high degree vertex, that means you're connected to a lot of other people. So you look at the distribution of degree over the network, right? Who's highly connected, who's not very connected, and you get this distribution of degree for the network. And you can pick out people who are really influential, have lots of connections, and people who aren't, right? You can look at vertex or edge centrality. How central are you to the network? You may have very few connections, but you play a pivotal role in the network structure. So, for example, if I go back one, and you see the picture on the left, there's the two people from the two separate subnodes that are really close to each other. They're talking to each other, and they're important because they're linking those two subnetworks together. So even though they themselves don't really have any more connections than anyone else, they have this critical link between them, okay? So are you central to the network? Are you a hub, meaning lots of people are connected to you, or are you a spoke? You're out somewhere. And then community structure. So network people like to talk about network topology, meaning I can look at a network, but then I can also look at substructures in the network, right? So we're all sitting in this room, we're all talking to each other, but then there might be subgroups of us who've known each other for a long time, and then we kind of break off and have our own little conversation while I'm talking because you're trying to stay awake, and you say to somebody else, man, I did not have enough coffee at lunch. And they go, no, neither did I. And nobody else hears you, right? Because they're all thinking the same thing, but they're not telling you that. And so you have different relationships within the network. And so they think about structure, and they'll talk about different kind of shapes that appear in networks. And so there's different ways to think about them. And there's literally a gazillion. There literally are a gazillion ways to measure each of those, right? And there's a ton of literature on how to define and characterize networks. So I'm just going to say about a couple of them, right? Don't want to go too deep into it. Okay, so one is what I said was degree distribution, right? So you can look at the probability distribution of the number of connections that each node has to everybody else, right? So common choices are like a binomial for P, power law, where you have, e to the some power. So some people have very few connections, and then there's some people that have a ton of connections, right? So if I'm in Nebraska and I looked up the Twitter feed for Warren Buffett, I'd probably see that he's connected to a bazillion other people, but they may not be connected to each other. They're just all connected to him, right? Because they're all following what he's saying, right? So he has a very, very high degree, but the people following him may or may not, right? Okay. So you can look at degree distribution as a way to characterize. So this is an example of a graph where you're talking about directed edges, right? So if I'm following Warren Buffett, he's talking to me, but I'm not talking to him. Or if I am talking to him, he's not listening, right? So it's a one-way street, right? He's talking to me. So directed edges, right? Now I may then talk to my friend. So my in degree is how many things I'm listening to, and then my out degree is how many people I'm talking to, right? So you can have in degree and out degree for people. So this is just an example of in degree and out degree for different articles on Wikipedia, right? Which I thought was pretty cool. So you look at the number of articles, and then you look at how many people read the articles, talk to other people, and link to other articles. How many articles link to something, but that article doesn't link back to them. Okay. So degree distribution is one. Component structure, right? Components or cliques in a network. So when we're doing a project on graphical models in metagenomics, right, in microbial samples. And the idea is, okay, which microbes are interacting with each other? And can you infer that from the sequences that are present, right? So I may find out that different strains of a species tend to hang out together, right? They share a lot of information, and I get them as this little subnetwork. They're all talking to each other because they're all highly related. But they may not be related to another species that's in the sample. Or they may be, right? So you get these different dependencies among microbes. You can look at average clustering coefficient. So it's like the fraction of nodes that are sort of adjacent to each other and share edges. So you look at a node and you say, okay, how many other nodes connect to that one? And then how many of those connect to each other? Right? So how are you actually making a cluster? So are the nodes that are close to you talking to you, or are they not talking to you? Right? What do you want to be when you grow up? Data storage. And then you can talk about sampling. So the way they think about sampling from a statistical standpoint, so if you talk to people who work mostly in computer science and they collect a lot of data on social media, they think of it as, I just collect everything. I've collected the whole universe. So It's just there. The truth is right there because I just collected it. Statisticians go, I don't know about that. Sounds good. I don't think that's true. So I really think that what you're capturing, especially if you think of networks as dynamic, you're just capturing a snapshot of some underlying true network that I need to infer. For statisticians, that's so much better. It's like, yes, okay, I got you. Right, I'm inferring the underlying true model. All right. So there's an idea of like the whole network is way too big and too dynamic. So we're essentially going to just sample from it and then try to infer what we think the true underlying network is. And there's different approaches to sampling from networks. And I mentioned a couple. I don't know if I'll have time to go through it, but there's different approaches to sampling. You can just directly sample, just unbiased, random, completely sample nodes or sample edges. You can do things like snowball sampling, random walks, or importance sampling, or you can do MCMC where you try to let the network evolve. Snowball is kind of interesting. It's like it's really good for finding subpopulations that are rare or unusual, because what you do is you take all the people in the network and you go, I'm interested in pink unicorns. Not too many pink unicorns in there. So let's find a pink unicorn. You find your pink unicorn, and then you go, hey, pink unicorn, I need you to tell me where the next pink unicorn is, because I bet you guys will talk to each other. And you let that person lead you to the next pink unicorn and the next pink unicorn, right? So you get some picture of your pink unicorns. Of course, it's not random. It's completely biased, right? It's totally biased. But you get information that it would be very hard to get if you just random sampled, because they're so rare that you probably would rarely ever pick them up. Okay, so there are different tasks that people do. You can sample the vertices and the edges, and you can estimate the average degree. How connected is this network to itself? Is it a big giant ball of death spider web where everybody's interacting with each other, or is it fairly sparse and everybody's talking to somebody but not too many people? Can I sample small subnetworks that represent the structure of the entire network? That's a trickier question, right? So you're thinking about it's a big network and it has all these complex dependencies in it. Is there a way I can sample from it where, in some probabilistic sense, I get the core structures of the entire network in my subsample? Okay, so maybe you sample in a way that the degree distribution looks the same. Okay, there's different ways to do it. You want to sample local substructures and talk about how frequently they occur, right? So I might take everybody on Twitter who likes to talk about organic farming, and I might go, well, I wonder what the substructures look like, and I wonder if the people who are talking about organic farming in St. Louis do more talking to each other than the people in organic farming in Western Oregon, right? I mean, how often are they communicating with each other? Do they communicate with each other? Right, that sort of thing. How active are those smaller groups? Okay. Right, okay, so basics of network sampling. You assume the network's connected, right? You assume that in some sense everybody's loosely connected to somebody else. You're going to get nodes where they don't talk to anybody in social networks, like you get somebody who has a Twitter account but never uses it. You just assume that, I can ignore that person. They are not socially active. They talk to themselves, great for them, not really good for everybody else. Okay, and then you assume that the true network is kind of hidden but allows you to sample from it, right? So you can crawl along through the network and grab someone and then grab their person they're connected to and the person they're connected to. So you can kind of walk around the network even if you can't see the whole thing. So there's different ways of sampling. There's sampling, if you want to traverse a graph and look at the paths that people are following, how I'm connected to somebody and then they're connected to somebody else. It's like the Kevin Bacon problem, 6 degrees of separation, right? Everybody's within 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. It's like that. You traverse around and you sample without replacement. So you might go from me, and then you might go, oh, okay, she's connected to Camillo, and then you go to Camillo, and then they'll say, oh, Camillo's connected to somebody at the University of Miami, and then, they're connected to somebody right, and you just walk along and choose a path. Right, snowball sampling is like subject referral. That's what I just said. You can also do, so here's snowball sampling, good for rare populations, it's cheap, it's very efficient. You're the pink unicorn, you tell me where the next pink unicorn is. I get another pink unicorn. I don't have to do all this sampling to get one. It's very, very efficient. Don't have to plan much, but not much control over it, right? And it's bias. But you can do exploring in different ways. You can go in a linear path. You can discriminate. You can say, okay, you're a pink unicorn. You refer to me another pink unicorn. And then they tell you about 2 other pink unicorns. You find out one's not really pink. It's not pink enough. Not good. So you exclude. You go with the pinker person. And so you have some criteria whether you accept somebody's recommendation or not. And you can move through networks like that. Oh, okay, got it. Now, you can also do random walk, where you're doing with replacement. So you can visit me, and then you can visit Camilo, and then you can visit me, because maybe he doesn't have any friends, he's talking only to me. Right? So you can sample. Okay, don't worry, I'm not meant defensive, just, all right. It could be me, I'm the one who has no other friends, so I talk to Camilo, and then he feels bad for me, so he talks back to me. Okay? So you can explore neighbors, and you can visit me more than once. Okay, classic is you just walk, right? And at each iteration you visit somebody next to me, and you just pick people at random. So if I'm connected to 10 other people, so my degree is 10, you could just pick somebody who's in my neighborhood to talk to, and then if they're connected to 10 people, including me, you could randomly select from those 10. You might get me back again, that's okay, but you might get somebody else, right? Completely random sampling. Okay, so if you random walk, sample edges uniformly, the bad thing is that you're going to be biased towards people that have lots of connections. Because, if somebody's connected to everybody else in the network, so Warren Buffett example, so he's connected to a zillion other people, but they don't talk to each other. So he looks like a dandelion, he's in the center, everybody is connected to him. So when you sample, you're going to sample the people he's talking to, and then they don't talk to anybody else, so you're going to sample back to him. Right? So he's connected to so many people that is biased towards the people that have lots of connections. That's just how it works. And there's ways you can correct that in sampling. You can make random walk sampling. You can do a correction so that it's not biased. The way you do it is you just build in a Metropolis Hastings step where you either accept or reject someone, right? So you have this process where you go, well, you know what? I've already visited Warren Buffett like 100 times. Could we get off the Warren Buffett thing? Right, okay. And so you choose to not accept when he comes up again. So the way you do is you define your task. What are you going to do? You select your objective. Why am I sampling from this network? You say, do I have any restrictions on data access, right? So like Twitter doesn't let you see everything. You only get so much information. So you have to consider, well, I know I wanted to ask this question, but I only get data on this. So, okay, all right, I'll work with that. If you choose your sampling method, then you evaluate how it works, right? That's sort of the process in this. So social media. So these are people that do work in social media. So I showed you a picture from NodeXL, which was the pink slime Twitter. Their tool is open access. It's easy to use, and it's kind of fun. There's a cuttlefish tool that does nice network visualization. It's a SourceForge package, so you might need like a computer scientist to help you out a little bit, but it's not super complicated. It does nice pictures. There's a graph tool, which is a Python toolbox for looking at networks. So there are definitely tools out there to use if you want to explore social media. And these tools, except for the NodeXL, which is really based on social media, the other ones will work for any networks. So it doesn't have to be social media. I mean, everybody talks about social media just because it's the big thing out there. And, if you've got a gazillion people on Facebook, people talk about Facebook. It's just the nature of things. But there are networks in lots of other contexts of science outside of social media. And so you can use these for, biological networks, transportation networks, communication networks, not specific to social media. Okay, so questions. I think we have about 15 minutes. What do we have? Hour? Really, have an hour? Whew. Okay, man.
So we actually are ahead of schedule, and this is really the time for discussion, open questions and discussion. Excellent. And so anything during the day that you want to go back to and revisit or have more discussion about or have questions about, now is the time.
Okay, so one thing I did want to mention that I haven't had a chance to, and then you guys can ask questions. Remote people, you are free to ask questions at any time. Okay, so just stop me. It's good to interrupt me. It's okay. So one thing I did want to mention was that the National Science Foundation has put out a call for regional hubs for big data, okay? So I'm going to explain this, and I'll actually post the NSF presentation slides to the web page so you can kind of see if you're interested in this. So the idea was that the NSF, they fund, this is coming from their director of computer science, computer and information sciences and engineering. NSF came to the realization that they fund research in big data. They fund infrastructure in big data. They fund education, so they have training grants for people who want to work broadly in computer science. They do not fund partnerships. They don't fund consortia for this, right? So, and I think by example, they decided that, you know what, it would be good if we supported collaborative work, because especially in the big data world, everybody can't afford to be doing the same thing. There's just not enough resources to do that, right? So every university, or lots of them, have some kind of computing services, and they might have a high-performance computing center, and they might be storing data. But wow, it's so much better when you share. And it saves so much in terms of resources. So for example, at the University of Nebraska, we don't do long-term data storage at the University of Nebraska. We go, well, let's see, who stores a lot of long-term data? National labs. So let's partner with the national labs and get the national labs to store our data. It's what they do. They do petabytes of it, and they will gladly store our data long-term, and it will be cheap, because that's what they do, right? Makes a lot of sense. Instead of saying, hey, we really need to build a cold storage for data at the University of Nebraska. No, you don't. Right? It's cold storage. It's not stuff people are going to be busy accessing. You just want to keep it, okay? So go to some place that keeps a lot of data, right? So NSF is starting what they call a hub, node, and spoke system across the country. So there's going to be a hub in each region of the U.S., so census regions. So there's one in the Northeast, there's one in the South, there's one in the West, Idaho, people, Oregon, Utah. There's one in the Midwest. And initially, NSF is simply offering enough funds to start a hub, right? So the idea of the hub would be administrative hub, executive director, somebody who would help with logistics and sort of help everybody in the region have meetings about different topics in big data, initiate various partnerships on big data problems. And so we have one in the Midwest. I know there's one in the West. I don't know who the PI is in the West, but I could probably find out. There's a bunch of universities in each region who are involved. And really what we're doing is it's like you write a 15-page proposal and you say, this is my region, this is what we do in big data. These are problems that are relevant to the region, right? So in the Midwest, what do we put in there? We put in digital agriculture, because we're the Midwest. We put in water, food, energy, because that's critical to our region. We put in urban cities, because we're doing Chicago, Detroit, that whole Rust Belt region, right? Really interested in smart cities. And so you identify focus areas that you think, wow, it'd be really nice if the universities in the region could talk to Union Pacific and BNSF about rail in the Midwest, and maybe they have problems associated with big data that we could partner, right, and try to address challenges and things like that. So if it's something that if you're interested in hearing about it or interested in knowing about it, it's a good general resource. Right before this meeting, I came from Kansas City, where I met with the Great Plains Network. It's a consortium of people in computer science who are interested in bringing in the concepts of data science, and from the libraries, data curation, sort of across the region. And they have meetings, and they talk to people in Arkansas, and they talk to people in Nebraska, and they talk to people in the Dakotas, and the people across Kansas. And so it's supporting those types of activities where you could sit down and say, hey, we have a challenge, and then you say what your challenge is, and they go, we have that challenge too. And then, oh, wow, well, if we all are having this issue, then why don't we all work together instead of trying to compete with each other? Which in big data space is important, because the computational time and expense is so large that it's good to borrow. And most high-performance computing sites and things like national labs want you to use their resources because the way they power themselves, so this is what most HPC centers do, is they bring in enough resources and infrastructure to handle peak capacity. Who's our biggest user? What is their maximum capacity? What is their maximum need going to be? And they build to meet that, which means that most of the time, parts of it are sitting idling because the biggest user doesn't use that all the time. And so most of them are looking for people to use their resources because they're going to have downtime where it's just sitting. And they're like, oh, it'd be really nice if somebody would use this because right now it's sitting around, right? So that was something I wanted to mention because it's sort of an interesting experiment the NSF is putting together. Yes, I had a list. If I can find it, I will see if I can get the web resource. Let me see. I can probably just pick it up on the web. So what I did was in each topic, blue circle of death. I put on the web. Okay. See if I can find it. Okay. Right, so I posted the materials. So agenda, obviously, and then PDFs of presentations, because I didn't know in advance if people wanted to print out the slides, right? And also for the people who are remote, sometimes it's hard for them to see the slides here, so I wanted them to have a copy. I posted an additional set of slides on metagenomics, because it wasn't a topic that I was going to get to cover today, but I thought if anybody's interested, at least there'll be something there they can look at. Then I put up a bunch of big data resources under different topics. Most of them are papers or white papers. Some of them are more mathematical than others. Some are more applied. Some of them are like from blogs. So I have something up there from Jeffrey Leake, who's teaching the Coursera course in data science, where he talks about, how is statistics important in big data, especially tools from applied statistics. I have stuff on modeling from social networks and some notes on 7 steps for learning data mining, data science, right? So if you want to get started and you don't know the field, then that's fine. I mean, there's lots of people who just call themselves data scientists because it sounds nice. It's kind of like calling yourself a bioinformatician was, 10 years ago. It's like, wow, that's pretty cool, right? So what does that mean? Some notes on statistical learning theory, which is more DMML stuff. And then they have like tutorials and things like that. And then I have a different set of genomic resources. So if you want to learn more about sequencing and how to go from sequencing to genomes. And then I also put up a page called Web Resources. See if I can get it. Aha! Wow, the magic of computing. Okay, and I have like lists of different web resources under different topics, right? So I have the URLs for different things. Like, okay, if you want to learn more about big data tools, like Hadoop and Mahout, which is basically, I love that word, Mahout. So Mahout is really a software tool for doing machine learning in Hadoop. So you Mahout your Hadoop. I'm telling you, this lingo is great. I mean, wow, and I say these things and my kids just look at me like, that sounded really cool. And I'm like, yeah, I know you didn't understand any of that, but didn't it sound neat? Mahout, my Hadoop? Oh, that's awesome, right? And then there's links to like institutes, like Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. It's very, very cool. They do a lot of work in things like complexity of life systems, and they have different workshops that are really cool. The blogs that you might want to find out what are people saying about things. Top research papers in big data. So from the computer science perspective, when they talk about big data, they talk about tools. And they talk about like file systems, and they talk about file storage. So if you're a statistician, it's kind of like, yeah, okay, but that's not really my area. That's what you do so that I can analyze the data that you put in there. But it's always good to know what they're saying, because then when you go to talk to computer scientists and you say, hey, I really need access to this data, and they say, oh, you mean you need to Mahout your Hadoop? You can go, yes, exactly, thank you. That was what I wanted, right? I put up tools for networks and different ways people do networks and analyze networks. And Eric Kulziak at Boston University has a very nice tutorial on statistical analysis of network data, and he goes through sort of the basics of network analysis. It's very well done. Then I put in stuff for bioinformatics that are online tools. So, for example, David is a great resource if you're working in biology and you have a gene or a protein and you're just like, I don't really know what it does. I mean, this happens all the time, right? You do a biological experiment and you do differential gene expression and you get a list of genes. What? 80% of them nobody's heard of. Nobody knows what they are. Sometimes they were discovered in a completely different medical area, so they have some name that's completely misleading, and you're like, deafness 1. Okay, why is deafness 1 popping up in a study that has nothing to do with deafness? Well, it's because originally that's the context in which it was discovered. And so it's good to go to David because it'll give you a report on different genes and different chromosomes. And so I have a whole bunch of stuff there. Microbiome informatics. So Eric Alm, who's a researcher at MIT, he does microbiome. He has a clinical resource to do fecal transplants for people who have inflammatory bowel disease and other serious intestinal problems. And he did a very cool study where he and his grad student, I would never do this to a grad student, they had to basically collect samples every day for a year. And he said the reason that he did it, the reason he did it was because he couldn't recruit anybody. Gee, I wonder, right? Well, people weren't lining up to volunteer for that. Come on. So he basically said, okay, I was going to have my student in my lab do it. And one of the people in my lab volunteered. And then I sort of felt bad, so I decided I was going to do it too, right? And the data is fascinating. It's really, really cool to look at because you can see temporally things that happen in his life that like drastically changed his microbiome, right? So for example, he said in that year he traveled to Singapore, right? So he travels to Singapore, and of course, change in diet, change in environment, you can just see his microbiome just shift completely. It's like all the bugs in his microbiome went, like you're kidding me, right? Completely changed it, and then he came back, it goes back to where it was before. Then he gets food poisoning. You can see the microbiome go. And in his presentation, he came and gave a presentation on this. He goes, and I went to my doctor and I told him that I probably got food poisoning. And he told me it was a virus. Wrong. He looks at his microbiome. It's like, no, bud, you got a serious bacterial infection. No question about it, right? So he's like, I'm going to show my doctor that. So collapse, right? And you can see the whole community just get crushed by some pathogen, right? And so it's really, really fascinating to look at that data, right? Just to see the patterns over time and the fact that given certain influences, the microbiome will change and then recover. It will come back to where it was. It will come back to some sort of normal state. And then if you get a really bad infection, it may not come back, right? It just drastically changes the whole community structure. And then, what are you going to do? So it was very, very interesting. He does a lot of cool work in microbiology. And then I put up some stuff on ensembling, and sort of more general statistics. So there's an R blog, which is really useful. Things on machine learning. There's SAMSI, which is an institute in North Carolina that does statistics and applied mathematics, and they host workshops every year on different topics. So I think this year it's like statistical ecology, and another year it was networks and statistics in neurology. And so they do these different topics, different workshops, and they're always very interesting, and they pick topics that are sort of current. So it's a nice place to go. And usually there's a lot of statisticians that are involved because it's in the triangle area. It's just full of statisticians. So it's sort of nice to know what the kind of things that they're thinking about and looking at. So this is on the web page, and I put up all this. And then after this, what I'll do is I'll get the audio video, we'll get the AV stuff, and after some careful editing, well, I'll put it up here. I'll put links up. So if I suddenly show up and I'm 5'8" and have blonde hair, just roll with it. We're rolling. Just roll with it. So I'll make sure that's up there so that people can look at it. And of course, you can always contact me by email if you have questions. So if there's something I talked about today or I mentioned, and you leave and you kind of go, did she really say that? I don't know about that. I don't think. You can email me. You can just email me and ask. Or if I say something and you thought, that was interesting, I wonder if I could learn more about that topic, then that's fine. Ask, and I will try to at least get you started.
And we do have time right now to go back to anything that people want to revisit.
You want to go back to something I said this morning that's been bugging you, or something that you want to learn more about, I'm more than happy to go back and discuss different topics. Big data is a tough one, particularly for, and I'm not sure why, but I think statisticians in general some of them have kind of jumped into it, but because it involves, just by necessity, a lot of interactions with computer science and a certain amount of computer science knowledge, it's a little bit difficult for statisticians to get started because it's like an area they don't know, and like any other area you don't know, there's always that kind of hesitancy to get involved. When I went to the workshop the NSF hosted on this big data hub in the Midwest, a whole bunch of people showed up, mostly academics, because that's who NSF talks to. It's like 80% academics. But of all the people at that workshop, there were probably 100 people, two statisticians. The rest of them were all computer science, CSE, right? So it was like me and the VPR from Iowa State.
But, a lot of times I think it feels like statistics is not valued. And big data, they say, we don't need statistics anymore. And right. All of the classical things we were taught come up with a hypothesis, and all that. It's like, we don't need to do that.
We don't need that, right. That's not relevant to us anymore.
So do you think that statisticians need to do a better job of explaining what we do? Is it that we need to adapt to the new reality? Because there are, as you showed us this morning, there are statistical approaches that are very important. So we need to adapt, but we also need to educate.
I think it's a twofold thing. It's part of it is that computer science, like any other field, this is true of all of us, values themselves more than others. That's just the nature of what we do, right? So when I look at a problem or I go to a workshop, I'm looking at it from a statistical standpoint, right? And so I think that the statistical issues are the important ones. But someone who's not a statistician, okay, great, but why? I mean, I'm more interested in the biological part of this problem, right? So we all come with our biases. And computer science is the same. And they have been, I think computer science in some respects jumped in first because the initial problems with big data were CS problems. The initial problems were, how do you capture that much data? How do you store that much data? And then how do you manipulate that much data? And those are not really statistical questions. Those are computer science problems, right? So they jumped in first. And the physics people jumped in first. And the physics people jumped in because they had to. So the physics people started the CERN project, the Light Hadron Collider, which is in Europe. And it generates a petabyte a day. So if you're going to run a project like that, you have to solve your big data storage problems right away. And so the physics people were actually before the CS people. So if you talk to CS people who've been in CS a long time, they'll tell you, oh yeah, like usual, we're following the physicists. Right, because the physics people had to do it. They had a problem, they must fix the problem. And so they really started the big data part. And then the computer science people saw, ooh, wow, we could collaborate with them and do stuff. And so I think by the nature of it, it sort of came through computer science. And then once they figured out, we can store data, we can access data, then it was, we can answer questions with data. That means, okay, go talk to the statisticians, right? And so sort of by nature, we were second in line, maybe third. So that's part of it. Yes, the other part is that there's a lot of people who work in the field who don't understand statistics, and so don't understand why it's important. And I find that a lot. It's almost like just a blind spot that they think that, well, once I collect it and have it, then I have information. No, you have data. Big difference, right? Yes.
It seems like this proliferation of visualization is a process that really underscores the descriptive aspects rather than the inferential and replaces inferential with description.
Yes.
So, and it's so beautiful.
You get sucked right in.
Really beautiful. But meaning, is a real question, I think. And so I think getting a statistician's, an inferential statistician's message across is much more difficult in that environment.
Yes, because people go, pretty pictures. And they're really cool, right? And you go, wow, that's great. And that's kind of, it's the step towards inference, right? So even in networking, it's like, well, what do I have, really? And you want to look at it, and you want to poke at it. And then you say, oh, that's what it looks like. Okay, I could ask this question. Ooh, okay. So, yes, initially, it still is, in some sense, very descriptive-oriented, very characterization-oriented, not so much inferential, right? But if the groups that have been working with big data for a long time are definitely interested in the inference part, right? So it doesn't surprise me that places like Google are big on getting statisticians, because they've sort of moved beyond the phase of, wow, that looks cool. I like the characterization. It's like, yeah, you like it, but there's questions and problems you need to solve and you need to answer. So it's evolving. It definitely is evolving. And so part of it is us explaining the value that we bring to projects, right? So when I review grant proposals for the NIH, and I sit on committees where I'm the only statistician, and that's not at all unusual. And so because I'm speaking to people who are highly trained, very intelligent, but not necessarily quantitatively trained, I have to explain why is this important. So I'll make a comment about an application, and they'll say, well, how important is that really, that consideration? And I have to explain that, yeah, okay, this is why this concern is important. So it puts a bit of a burden on us to say, this is what we do. Partly because statistics is still not standard in a lot of degree programs. Maybe you take one course, Stat 100, Stat 200, whatever you call it. And, people take it, and it's like the basic stuff. And they go, that's great, I passed my stat class. And then it goes in some part of their brain that's rarely activated. And then maybe if they do their degree, or maybe if they get to their master's and they're doing a degree project, they'll go, oh, I need statistics. And try to blow off that part of their brain and do something. But it's not part of the way that they think. It's not part of the way they approach problems. And so part of it is making sure we continually educate people about the way that we think, and that it may be different, but it's also can be valuable. Right? And that's part of our challenge. Yes?
This morning we talked about trees,
yes.
Bayesian averaging.
Mm-hmm.
Do any of those methods apply to the two examples we had this afternoon?
Okay, so I would say yes to both, but in different ways. So, okay, so let me see. I'm going to pull up the networking. Oh, Camilla, your slides are online too, right? Your genomic stuff. Oh, I might as well just pull up your slides too. Okay, so
Can you repeat in the
yeah, give a question. Oh, reread the question. Sorry. So the question was, this morning we talked about trees, and we talked about ensembling and ensemble methods and Bayes model averaging. Are those relevant to the examples that we saw in the afternoon? So do they have a relevance to relevance to genomics and or to network analysis? And my answer was yes, but in different ways. So if we look at, I don't need to pull up the trees, but I'll just pull up your genomics thing and see if I can get it. So in the genomics world, most of this was talking about processing and how RNA-seq works. Okay, but if you look at, okay, I'm not going to do Fred Sanger, who's brilliant. We'll just skip that. Sorry, Fred. Okay, what to do with it? Okay, RNA-seq. So you're talking about transcriptome and transcriptome sequencing and differential gene expression. So in terms of differential gene expression, both networks and trees, or both trees and ensembles apply in that context, and I'll tell you why. Because so it's very common in genomics that suppose you're looking at case control, normals, patients, however you want to define it. You'll get a list of, you can pretty easily get a list of differentially expressed genes. There may be 5,000 of them. And you're like, okay, well, that's sort of descriptive. Now I've sort of described the difference between these two groups in terms of the transcriptome. But what I'd like to know is which ones are most important to give an outcome. So which ones have the biggest influence on, say, whether you're a case or a control. Right? I know they're different, but how is that important? Or maybe I know that my patient set is not homogeneous, which it almost never is. Right? So any kind of disease, you have different ages, different genders, different stages, all this variability in your patient set. And so you say, well, which genes are most important or different the most between these different subgroups? Can I define different subgroups in the data based on expression? And so that's where the trees come in. That's where the ensemble comes in, because you're trying to identify key variables, and you have a large set of variables, thousands, right? And so it's common that people would use random forests or other ensemble methods to try to answer those kinds of questions. So it's one step back from just doing the transcriptome in terms of characterization. Now you're trying to answer questions about it. So for example, I might say, okay, which members of the transcriptome have the largest influence on time of survival or time to recurrence or something like that? I have too many variables to like put in a logistic regression, right? So I use another technique like trees or averaging to get at that question, right? So it definitely applies. In the networking context, they do something similar with the ensembling. What they'll do is they take a very large network, they'll subsample from it, and they'll build a network on each sample. And then they want to do some sort of average, some sort of composite network, right? And so they'll use methods from ensembling to try to get a consensus network from the ones that they build on different samples. So it's a very good question. You're absolutely right. There are connections between the two just because of the dimension of the data, right? Yes.
So my question is maybe a little bit rookie, but people keep talking about data mining and machine learning, right? Mm-hmm. So what is the real difference between these two? Or are they the same term? Just people prefer different way to say that. And how does that relate to like traditional statistical inference methodology, such as,
right?
For example, like when people talking about the machine learning, they talk about random forest, they talk about tree methods, but does that mean like we cannot use linear regression for machine learning? So what does that mean for?
Okay, so the question was, people talk about data mining and machine learning. What is the difference between those two? And so what's sort of considered data mining, and then what's considered machine learning? And if you're, and correct me if I mischaracterize, if you're using a sophisticated method or something from machine learning, does that mean that you can't use linear regression or you can't use standard statistical tools? Or, is that considered not machine learning? Okay, so I'll try to answer that the best that I can. People tend to kind of smush the data mining and machine learning worlds together, mostly because people in those communities tend to do both. Right? So I think of machine learning as a method of data mining. So it can be used to find interesting variables or interesting observations in a large amount of data. So I sort of, to me, I conceptualize them as very similar. People would say that data mining is just more, it's searching for patterns, it's searching for relationships, it's searching for informative characteristics in large amounts of data. And you can do that in different ways. You don't necessarily have to use something from machine learning to do that. You can use linear regression to do that. You can use chi-squared tests and t-tests, and you can use anything to do that, right? So data mining does not necessarily mean, by definition, that, machine learning must follow. No. You can think of data mining as just data analysis. I mean, it's just, people think data mining sounds cooler. It kind of does sound cool. But you can use all the standard analytical tools that we know and love, and I use them often. So still, all the tools that we've used, the linear models, the ANOVAs, the mixed models, logistic regression, just t-tests, chi-square tests, all those things are all relevant. They really are. And some of them you can do very quickly on large amounts of data, right? So, and they answer a lot of questions. I mean, a lot of basic questions that people ask, you can just do a t-test or do a non-parametric t-test, right? So non-parametrics gets a lot of attention because you can't necessarily make distributional assumptions, right? So it's like, okay, I was going to do a t-test, now I do a Wilcox-Hamilton rank test. All of those tools are relevant, okay? And I think of machine learning as a certain toolkit for data mining, right? So depending on the question that you have, some of those tools can be very useful. So, for example, if I'm looking at data that's relatively complicated, unstructured, and you start with sort of the basic models, basic approaches, maybe linear regression, maybe chi-square test, depending on outcome and all that, and you find that your models are really bad. Linear models, your linear model donkey is trying to kick you and doesn't like it, and the machine learning is just another set of tools that you can use to try to get information out of data, right? They tend to make less distributional assumptions, which is kind of nice. On the other hand, they are less interpretable, which is not so nice. So you're sort of giving up the nice statistical theory and assumptions and benefits that you get from distribution-based techniques like linear regression for things that are more non-parametric, maybe more robust, potentially, but are harder to understand, harder to interpret. Right? So there's always a trade-off.
And maybe more dynamic?
And maybe more dynamic, absolutely, right? No question about it. So, methods for things like streaming data, definitely more dynamic. Sequential analysis, definitely more dynamic. But probably less amenable to standard statistical theory. And so it's really just another set of tools. And that can be useful. It just depends on different contexts, right? So I sort of think of people tend to smush the two together, but data mining, I think, that's really just data analysis in some sense, right? It's applying tools to data, right? Trying to get information out of data. Okay, who isn't? We call it data mining because it sounds cool, but I don't exactly wear a mining hat, and I don't exactly have a light on my forehead. It's just data analysis. And then, yeah, machine learning is much more non-parametric, nonlinear methods. So approaches that tend to have less theory behind them because they're newer and they're more complex, but certainly can be useful. So no, just because you can use machine learning methods doesn't mean that they're necessary or that they're even appropriate. It depends on the question you're trying to answer. And if you can use a simpler method to get the answer, use it. It's fine. Not every problem is a machine learning problem. It's back to the don't hit all the nails cartoon. It's fine to use existing models. They are very useful. There's a reason they've been around a long time. It's just in certain contexts they're not as effective, so you use something else. Yes.
Are there any websites where the big data are available for research purpose?
Yes, there is let me see if I put it in my resource page, because I know I had it somewhere. If I didn't put it in there, I will add it. There is a web page for, did I put it in here? I don't know if I put it in here. There's a web page that has a link to data sources for data mining. No, it's not. It's just not informatics. KDD has a bunch of data. It's not KDD. Data Science Central might. Let's see. Data Science. I'm just looking to look up. Because when I go to maybe Data Science Central, I don't know. There's a couple different places that I look, like even KDE Nuggets has, Data Science Central, all right. Has a job board, has all kinds of other stuff, blog posts. See, analytics, data, big data, Hadoop, jobs webinars, data visualization, data plumbing, which is basically data cleaning.
Jobs and then hot jobs.
Yeah, I know, hot jobs. I don't want the job, I want the hot job. Woo! Yes, so there's this one that has a bunch of different stuff and different blog posts on big data, which can actually be very useful to hear what people are doing. Successful big data analytics startups in Seattle. There's also, if you go to I'll add these to it. UC Irvine machine learning repository. This one has a ton of data. And a lot of them are sort of standard, well-known data sets for different methods. And there's a ton of them. Most of them are classification problems, because that was really where the machine learning community started, was looking at problems in classification. But there is some stuff there are some regression data sets in here. And they have a whole bunch of classic ones, like the IRIS data set from Fisher, classic, right? I mean, just been done to death. But they have a whole bunch of different data sets that you can then play with. And then I think the NodeXL tool also has links to different ways to access social network data, so you can request data sets from them. So I'll add this repository to Camilo.
There's one called data.gov.
Uh-huh.
That's from the government.
Yep.
It contains all kinds of data sets from agriculture.
Mm-hmm. So Camilla was saying that there's a big, if you go to data.gov, it has a bunch of data sets from across the government. You can see it up on the page now, where you can get government databases to play with. And it's used to test different methods, and there's different topics, right? So here they have all these topics where you can get different data stuff. And then they talk about, different initiatives to share data and all kinds of stuff. So you can look for data sets in different areas. Yes?
It's going to just get more so. There's that initiative, federal government initiative. Anything federally funded must be publicly available, including the source data. So
Yes.
you get an NSF grant, you get an NCBI grant, you get a grant from DOE, you get it from anywhere. Your data's going online. That's
Yes.
part of the agreement.
That's
so
part of the deal.
if you want more data, just wait. You got more data.
Yeah, so now that they have data management parts of all your grants, everything has to be posted. So it depends on what you're interested in. If you're interested in genomic stuff, there's NCBI, probably Gene Express. How's it? Gene Expression. Okay. NCBI. Yeah, there we go. There's PubMed. No, I want to go GenBank. Yeah, Geo is probably the place to go. Right. So there's just a ton of genomics data here on the Gene Expression Omnibus. You can search for specific data sets. You can search for specific genes in data sets. You can search for specific biological contexts in which you want data. It's all public. Right? So it's all open access gene expression data. You can even go to the SRA. SRA is still working, right? Oh, my God. Okay, so the Short Read Archive is another one that NCBI does, and I'll try to add some of these to the resources page. There's the SRA, which is Short Read Archive. It's for sequencing data, right? So if you want to get sequencing reads, they have the toolkit, they have the data. You can go and see how much is in there, right? Look at this. Number of bases since 2009. It's like terabases, right? So it's like immense. And yes, it's going to get much, much bigger. So yes, you can get all kinds of public data that's out there to play with.